see you all this morning, and the trivia question of the day is, what day is it and where are we? A small question, but it reminds me of the saying, actually, a writing of Herman Melville when he was on a whale ship crossing the Pacific, and he wrote that the trade winds were blowing with a mild and steady strain on the canvas of the sails, and the ship was heading right out into the immense blank of the Pacific. Forever advancing, we seemed forever in the same place, and every day was as the former lived before. But the good news is Bill McKay saw a bird this morning, so there must be land somewhere out there. And in my time, I've been out across for long weeks out in the middle places, and I once wrote a novella about a ship crossing the ocean, and there was such weather and storms that when it expected landfall, there was no more land, and it kept going. And but it had a happy ending. When it ever gets published, I'll have copies of it someday. But meanwhile, it's sort of the one of the disturbing things about the sea when you're out here and you don't know where you are and you don't know where you're going to end up. Not a problem with Crystal. But today I'm going to talk about Captain Cook, who was, of course, the legendary figure in the Pacific and in exploration, has been a national hero and sometimes berated by some people for his incursion into these cultures. But he is still is considered the seaman and the ultimate explorer, and able to go on his expeditions and take care of his crew and come back with the scientific knowledge that literally changed the world. And as various people have just given him so much credit for his discipline and ability, and he was said more than any one person, he helped make the world one by going out to the ends of the world at the time. And he himself said he'd gone about as far as any person could possibly go. He sailed over 30,000 miles in his life. That's like 8 times around the earth. And he was but a very humble man and of humble origin. They say he burst out of poverty, having been born in Yorkshire, in Whitby, outside of Whitby, in a biggin, which was a thatched hut. And his parents were farm laborers with not any particular means at all. And he went to the port to get a job as an intern lad in a small shop, and some sailor gave him a coin from a faraway place, and he said that's where he decided to go to sea. Later pictures, you saw him in his Navy uniform, though he was a merchant marine, worked his way up, never went to an academy, never got a commission until late in life after his adventures and his accomplishments. But every painting of him shows him as a rather stern fellow. He's the captain who never smiled. Obviously, he didn't work on a cruise ship, but it was a testament to him that he could maintain his own personal discipline and that of the crew when many a ship had all kinds of problems, and he didn't even lose many crew all on his long voyages. He began by practicing as a cartographer. And so he made his first distinctions when he was in the Royal Navy, but as not as an officer, but as the ship's cartographer. And then he was noted for his very excellent draftsmanship. And so he made the first charts of Newfoundland and also the St. Lawrence River. He was given most credit for having sounded out in small boats and then drawn the entrances to the St. Lawrence River that led to the victory of the British at Quebec. And so then he was considered for higher calling. This is another of the passages up in Canadian waters, but he also left quite a bit of these kind of charts in the Pacific. So that became the fundamental basis for other sailors and explorers that came and went. So he took 3 voyages. I'm sure all of you've heard these the summary of it before, but the first one was down and around and came to Tahiti, then came to New Zealand, the coast of Australia, the eastern coast, and then back around. The second voyage was down all the way around Antarctica trying to see if he could find some habitable land down there, which he never did. And then the third voyage was when he came back to Tahiti, and then he went up and was the first to come to Hawaii, and then he went up into the Bering Sea, and then came back to Hawaii where he met his end. And so it's a little easier to see this different voyages in this illustration. The first is the red, the second is the green, and the third voyage is the blue. And each time the ships made it back, he didn't lose any ship on his journeys, but he pushed his limit of navigation and his crew to go to places where no one had been before from Europe. He wasn't the first to Tahiti. Actually, the French and Spanish, Portuguese sailor had been somewhat near, but he was the first one to stay and make detailed cartography of some of these places. This illustration is the mythical Terra Australis, which has been mentioned before, in the medieval conception of the world that had to have a celestial balance, and there must have been land down there somewhere. In this fanciful illustration, you see the various animals and lush tropical environment of it, which in some parts of the South Pacific you certainly have, but as you go down further, of course, it's quite different. At that time in England and Great Britain at the time, there was the leader of the Royal Society, the scientific chartered organization that planned the observations of the transit of Venus, which we've heard about already. And this was the mandate that came from King George and then was the cause of the support for Captain Cook's first voyage. And this was done because if you take the observation of the passage of Venus against the sun, and if you do that simultaneously in different parts of the world, then the mathematics could show the extent of distance, not just celestial, but also the size of the Earth itself. And so this was the refinement of mathematical geography that led the expedition to go. Now, Cook himself said he didn't want to have one of the Navy ships, which are either heavily armed or else they were meant to be a rapidly sailing frigate for war. He chose what he grew up on working as a collier. And this is the Whitby collier style of a boat, which is a very broad, heavy, has a bluff bow. They call it a cat bow, actually. And this he felt would be more suitable for carrying a lot of provisions and then being safe in unknown waters, more than a more tender ship, you'd say. And so this was the bark Endeavor that was fitted out and did the first voyage. Here's the reproduction that's in Darling Harbour in Sydney. And King George himself put in 4,000 pounds toward the fitting out of this rather common ship at the time. It's like taking out a big tanker in our current use of shipping. So it has a lot of room below, not many accommodations, and so he filled it up with the provisions, and here's an illustration of how many decks there are. But you can see in the aft, the captain's quarters, that was actually taken over by the other sponsor of the trip, Joseph Banks, who came along with his own scientific crew and instruments, and was the representative of the Royal Society to do the scientific work. But otherwise, they were all cramped in with all these supplies to go all the way there. They had a crew of 94 all aboard, and 18 months provisions when they were set it out. So it was a pretty uncomfortable trip, perhaps, rolling around without much room. And those days you didn't quite have the wine list that you have gotten used to. But this was a very capable ship, and the reproductions have sailed around the world now in the celebrations of this particular area. And so the one that's in Darling Harbour is often out and about on keeping the ship rigged and going. But again, it's a lot of hard labor that takes to run something like this. So the manpower to raise the sails and the anchors and all that. And I have a U.S. Coast Guard certification as a tall ship master, so I've worked on these kind of ships myself, and all I can say is it's a little tough on your back every day. You know, a lot of lines, a lot of work, and we don't get to flog like we used to, though. We've taken all the fun out of it. But you can see just to man a wheel that is connected by ropes and pulleys down to the rudder, often in a big sea, it would take 2 to 3 people just to hold the helm like that. And so the conditions were typical for the time, but what the biggest problem for European sailors back then was that they go out, and particularly in the tropics, and they had foul water, and then they also got scurvy. So Cook followed the advice of some of the nautical doctors that they would try out various foodstuffs that would probably prevent scurvy. And his expeditions were the first time that it was actually proven that if you take lemon, sauerkraut, whatever fresh greens, some different food that has enough vitamin C, then your teeth wouldn't fall out. You wouldn't be so ill at sea. Often half of a crew would die of scurvy on a trans-ocean voyage. But that was where it was understood, and Cook then was the example for the rest of the Navy and the merchant fleets to take care of their crew better that way. Well, for navigation, it was just at the beginning of our modern era of better knowledge of precisely how to get from here to there. This is an old medieval hourglass of sand, and it would measure a half hour usually of time, although it was very different when it would get into tropical humid air versus the northern cooler climates. But that's where we get the word the watch. You watch the glass, and then you turned it over in time, and so you would keep a running log of the time, and then that would allow you to estimate your distance. And so that term of looking at the hourglass comes right down to the watch we wear today. And then there was the other sighting instruments, quadrant, and other optical devices to take a noon sighting or to see celestial bodies and then judge where you are. And this was quite rudimentary back in those days, but you could get a latitude fairly readily by observations of the sunrise, the apparent noon, and such that would then give you how far north and south you were. The problem of longitude was the great challenge, and that was being settled by the design of chronometers. But here's an illustration of Cook and all of his instruments in on the Endeavour. As I said, Joseph Banks had his own party, an artist. He was a botanist by training, but he was a Scottish nobleman who, again, invested in the voyage and came on his great adventure in life. And he was considered, let's say, a bit of a fop by the rougher sailors, but he did manage to come and successfully catalog many plants, and his presence on board was very essential for the success of the mission. Now, this is a very curious projection map. It's called an azimuth equidistant map, and it kind of distorts the world, but you can see how they went all the way around. In the first voyage, he went down around the Horn, and he sailed what we call uphill, meaning against the Southern Ocean winds that are blowing from west to east. So that's kind of the rough way to go. Later voyages, he went the other way. But anyway, he got to Tahiti, and then he came to New Zealand and Australia, came all the way back over the first years. Now, we know this area because we have just been here now. And French Polynesia, he came through a lot of the Tuamotu reefs, and they're an unusual sight at sea because you don't see them until you get quite close, because they're usually a flat reef, and then they have a little bit of topography to them. But one of the officers wrote that it looked like crumpled paper on the sea, but if you got close without sounding and looking where there might be rocks, many a ship has foundered and been lost on those particular reefs until you get to Tahiti, where the mountains are higher, and we've already been there. This is an illustration of Bora Bora and Raitea. And you can see he actually came right where we were. Irurut Pass is right where we went in to go to that dock right there in town. So Cook took a voyage quite similar to us, but because of the sailing, he would have to tack, and depending on the weather, he would take quite a while just to get to wherever was next. So he did go to Bora Bora, but it did not have an opening gap, so he couldn't get the ship in there. He did stop at Moorea for a while, That has, of course, better entrances and harbors like this one in Morea. And, of course, for the sailors, this was the first time they'd ever been in this kind of a tropical Polynesian world, and it was quite astonishing to them. And this is where they first settled and had contact with the Tahitians. And he decided that he would go to what is Matavi Bay and set up camp to do the scientific observations. So he came into this fairly well-sheltered bay just on the east side of the island of Tahiti, and weighed anchor and then went in ashore and was greeted. And this encounter was actually fairly peaceful. The people had already been visited by Bougainville and other explorers, some of which they had some fighting with, but Cook was very careful to always send ashore offerings to them and express his peace. But one of the curious descriptions of the encounter was the longboats would be coming off of the main ship, and the boat would be rowed by the sailors who would not be facing forward. And so the Tahitians wondered whether these strange humans had eyes in the back of their head, because they seemed to know where they're going. It made no sense to them that you'd paddle or row a boat looking behind you. Anyway, somebody was keeping an eye out where they were going. But the artist aboard had some of the first, these are later paintings, but this particular illustration that comes from the logbook is the first time anybody had ever seen anybody who did that strange thing of going out in the surf on a board. Well, it's gotten more popular by then. Here's a recreation of the Endeavour being greeted in Tahiti. Many a movie has been made about these sort of things, and there are many tales of the intrigues and the problems that arose of all this. But here's Matavi Bay, where he went, and because of that peninsula, it has some shelter from the southern swell, and then it also has fresh water above that, and then land to build their houses and tent town. They built a stockade around it. This is actually the illustrations that they had. The artists typically would draw the profile of an island so that next time they came they could identify it. So here we are, the greeting between the chieftain and Cook and Banks. They put up their station and their instruments. They had a constant problem, though, of the Tahitians would always come and borrow things, and they were particularly good pickpockets. And of course, the European or the English here had all kinds of knives and telescopes and guns and such. Even it said that Joseph Banks' socks were stolen off of him in the middle of the night while he was asleep. So that created some tensions, and there were some fights and some capturing of each other, the negotiations of relations and then peace. But Cook kept it at a fairly peaceful level all the way through. So here at Point Vetus, they had their guardhouse. They did have some Royal Marines with them. And it's still there today. Of course, the tents are gone, but the actual waters in the bay are now. I showed some other pictures earlier of what's a beautiful park and the monument of Point Venus, where they had their camp and their observations. This was the artist that came along, Sidney Parkinson, under the engagement of Joseph Banks. And so he was the first to draw many of the plant specimens that then ended up coming back to the Royal Society. Here's the One Tree Hill, which was overlooking the whole bay, where they would go up and meet with some of the chieftains sometimes. And he also drew the canoes and some of the people. And so this is before photography, this was important to have an artist along. So here's some of the native housing, which we've seen. Remember in Right Head, there's a house just like that where the musicians perform for us. And so they made some observations that became the fundamental source of knowledge of this culture, which then, of course, went through a lot of transformations. One instance, they had captured a neighboring clan's warrior, and they were preparing for a ritual feast. And this, of course, shocked the Banks and Cook and the others that were shown this. But of great importance was all of the collecting that Banks and his party did, and many of them went back in our growing stock still at Kew Gardens back in England. So here are just some more illustrations of this marae, the ceremonial platform with the symbols of the totems that they rise, and then an offering of a pig up onto the marae. Then they also had some celebrations and dancing. So this was much to the curiosity of the foreign visitors there. And Cook himself said, both sexes express the most indecent ideas in conversation without the least emotion. Chastity is little but valued. The men will readily offer you the young women to strangers, even their own daughters, and think it very strange if you refuse. And later, Captain Bligh described this as the allurement of dissipation are more than equal to anything that can be conceived. And so they had to restrain some of the sailors from getting up there and dancing along, perhaps. And of course, this was all suppressed by the missionaries in the later era. Some of the marae mounds have been rebuilt with the symbols. Most of them are just a platform with only the vague memory of what used to happen there. But in recent decades and generations, there has been a revival of the dance traditions often recreated, including the fire dance, which they never noted when Cook was there, but it probably came from Samoa, and that's sort of a dramatic revival of perhaps an ancient ceremony that's now done at shows around Polynesia. On the further voyage, especially all the way back to England at the time, they brought Omai, who was a high chief's son from Tahiti, and he went all the way back to be the curiosity of London. So that was the first Tahitian that went all the way with Cook all the way back. Now we were just in the Cook Islands, of course, named after him, and he went through here and he saw Rarotonga for the first time, and charted these waters again, then continued on in this curious projection all the way down to the coast of New Zealand and around, and then up the coast of Australia. Now this again was a great surprise that they would find such a magnificent land with great snowy capped mountains and broad valleys and running rivers and more of almost a continental feel of it compared to all the little islands they had been before. So this land was first sighted by a young ship's boy named Nick, and so he is sort of a local hero on the North Island. They have a monument when Nick first sighted the land, and then they settled. They went down to what's now Cook Strait and went into various bays and places. Some places they were greeted, and some places they were actually repulsed. This is the kind of a romantic version of him having the Endeavour off the coast of New Zealand. But he did try to make peace with them, and in Cook, when he went and was there for the while, he said about the Maori, notwithstanding they are cannibals, they are naturally of a good disposition and have not a little share of humanity. And one of the Maori chieftain, Te Horeta, called Cook, he called him Kuku, and he called him a sky lord. And then he quoted a Maori saying is that a noble man cannot be lost in a crowd. Well, his name is, of course, well distributed around New Zealand, and of course he named the sound where he was his preferred anchorage after Queen Charlotte. And they would go up, often the shore was very cliff encased, and so in this case they actually tied the ship up with the lines ashore to the trees and felled a tree to have as a gangway onto the ship in Queen Charlotte Sound. And there are more of these kind of romantic paintings of the encounters, and also of the great Maori waka, the great war and voyaging canoes that were there. And again, this was the first time that evidence of these people was brought back to Europe with their fantastic tattoo faces and their various regalia. Of course, this goes on as a living culture, and we'll be there and we'll see this. Of course, Cook is not as popular among the Maori as he is among the European descendants, let's say, but it's a nation that was forged in some conflict because the Maori, unlike the other Polynesians, had tremendous fortresses on the shore that's called the Pa, and then they had pitched battles at times, and of course, they had conflicts between themselves. But this was a far more, let's say, warlike and developed culture, mainly because it had a bigger land and there were many more of them all through the different islands of New Zealand. So this has been recreated again for films, and this fantastic canoe with its waka with its great emblem on the stern. And then from there, Cook went on to what was then referred to as Nouvelle Hollande, because it was Tasman who first charted the southern coast of Australia, but Cook was the first one to go up the eastern shore. So he came up to Botany Bay, and again, later illustration of being greeted with spears and rocks by the Aborigine people of the time. But he did go in and put into Botany Bay, and then set up a camp there to see if he could go exploring in. But of course, it was completely different land and people than just New Zealand, much less Polynesia. And so he has the first descriptions of the Aboriginal people. And Dampier, the other English explorer, had been on the other side of Western Australia and described them as the most miserable people he had ever seen on Earth. And this has been an issue ever since then. We'll be there and we'll talk about it. But Cook famously wrote, though, that the Aborigines, he said, they may appear to some to be the most wretched people on Earth, but in reality they are far happier than we Europeans. He said this because being wholly unacquainted not only with the superfluous, but with the necessary conveniences so much sought after in Europe, they are happy in not knowing the use of them. They live in a tranquility which is not disturbed by the inequality of condition. The earth and the sea of their own accord furnish them with all necessary things in life. They live in a warm and fine climate and enjoy a very wholesome air, so they have very little need of clothing. They seem to set no value upon anything we gave them, nor would they ever part with anything of their own. Well, in the course up the coast, they went in what's Queensland, now called Cooktown, and they had run into a reef in their trying to get through the Great Barrier Reef, which is a bit of a maze for a ship, of course, and fortunately the coral had stuck into the hull and they were taking on water, but they did not sink, and they sailed the boat into the shore, then hauled it in with the lines to let it settle on the shore so they could make repairs. And then again, some of the local indigenous people came out and were very wary and quite surprised by this ship on their shore. And at one point, Cook insisted on making enough, let's say, relations so that he at one point invited them on board the ship. And at the time, they had already collected a whole bunch of sea turtles that were on the deck of the ship for their long passage back to England. And the Aboriginal group there, in their tradition, when they saw a turtle, they immediately would catch it, and then they would share it with everybody. And so they came on board, saw these turtles, and started grabbing them and putting them in their canoes. And then the sailors said, no, that's our food. They weren't allowed to have it because it was for the voyage. And this became sort of one of those first failure to communicate situations where they had to fight off the local people, who then set fire to the woods around them, hoping to burn the ship, which was pulled on to close to shore. So then they had to shoot guns and such to scare them away. So that was just the beginning of many more understandings. Anyway, they went on and they had their second voyage, which came all the way around, but this time went down to Cape Hope, the tip of Africa, and then they circumnavigated Antarctica. Now, this was also a time when Cook was quite famous for what he brought back and what he knew. And this time he took the John Harrison's H4 chronometer, which is a pocket watch, really, what came down to our time today. But that would mean that they could have a comparison of the time of the watch, which was a constant, with the local apparent noon. So what you do is you sight the sun at the very apogee of its rise and fall, and then you compare that to the clock chronometer, and then you can, by mathematics, know where your longitude is. So that was a great change in navigation right there that Cook assisted in it. And so here's the resolution and the adventure that went with, as a paired group, looking for the Terra Australis. And they went into the ice and went all the way around looking for a way into this cold and bitter place, and were the first to ever circumnavigate Antarctica. This was particularly dangerous because you take a sail ship into those waters and you either become becalmed, and a lot of places are sort of dead air down there, so you end up with a longboat rowing your way for days to go out further to sea to find some more wind so you can go somewhere. Also, if it becomes bad weather, you can have your rig ice up. Literally, ice will form all over your rig, and then that will break your rigging, and then you disable the ship. So from this time on until modern steam navigation, it was considered so hazardous to go down there because many a ship, particularly whalers and sealers, would go down there and never be heard of again because their ship iced up and they got lost. And so that's the terror of those particular times. But nonetheless, Cook made it through, and he drew the first chart of South Georgia Island, which of course then was the jumping off point for many an explorer to this day. That's where Shackleton, for instance, came for his refuge at the end of his great voyage. And so the third voyage, though, was started in 1776, which is a sort of a difficult year. And though Cook was chartered again to lead an expedition, he was shortchanged in his rigging and his supplies because, as he wrote in his own logbooks, the Navy that was going over to teach a lesson to the rebels in the colonies in America took all of the best supplies and many of the best crew because Lord North said that was more important than exploration. So Cook sailed out in the middle of let's say, the misunderstandings at the time, but he was famous around the world by now. Benjamin Franklin specifically instructed the Continental Army and Navy to not interfere with the important work of Captain Cook on this expedition because he was in service of all humanity, not just his nation. Well, he came all the way back down again to New Zealand, around to Tahiti, the Cook Islands, then came to Hawaii, and then went up to the Bering Sea and came on the way. He was on the coast of North America up through up to the Aleutians, and then went all the way up into the Arctic and came back. But his second officer was William Bligh at the time, who would have another phase of his career, let's say. But Hawaii at the time had not been contacted, and this again, sort of like the Maori, were a larger nation with particularly there were a lot of fighting between them, so they had tremendous war canoes, and they had a tradition of brutal combat between them. Cook tried to make peace with them and get provisions, and when he was there the first time, it went okay. He was on the Big Island, but of course the Hawaiians are a very dynamic bunch, and they have these tremendous feather capes and their own cultural differences from Polynesians and Maori, let's say. But the tragedy was that the rigging was so bad that Cook came back that he had to cut more spars and start making rope and things like this, and he was pretty ill by this time. And they had an incident where some of the Hawaiians took one of their boats. They came in, and Cook himself came to challenge the Hawaiians, and they started having a fight on the beach. And Cook himself was hit over the head, and he was grabbed by the Hawaiians. His other sailors had to retreat, and Cook was taken ashore. The local Hawaiians only returned his hand as evidence that he was no longer alive. And so this was a great tragedy when it was heard around the world. I'll just tell you that the Goethe himself, the great German poet, he wrote, "I cannot forget his death. It is a sublime death in all respects, and it is also beautiful that the majesty of the untamed world has claimed its rights on him." And others have described him that he Darwin himself said, Cook added a hemisphere to our civilization. And King George, in his official statement, says, thus fell our great and excellent commander. After a life of so much distinguished and successful enterprises, his death cannot be reckoned premature, since he lived to finish the great work for which he seemed destined, and was removed from the enjoyment rather than cut off from the acquisition of glory. Well, this has been a point of speculation by historians ever since. Had Cook survived, he might have, of course, been even more famous. He might have become the governor of New South Wales instead of William Bligh, who, if you know, was mishandled the Rum Corps rebellion in Sydney. And also some people have speculated Cook might have made peace in Hawaii and then had British protectorate over the islands of Hawaii, and it would not have fell prey to those Americans, and such speculation as that. Or he might have just had a retirement and written out his logs and feelings more, but his voice was silenced. The shipmates continued on. A junior officer clerk was given the command of the ship, and he took it to Petropavlovsk in Kamchatka, where he died of pneumonia. The crew, meanwhile, took the ship all the way back. And so the unfortunate ending of Cook meant that there was probably a lot more possibility that he would have been more successful in some ways. And in a reductive sense, I would say it was the American Revolution that shortchanged his ships that caused his death. But you can't change that now. Meanwhile, his wife in London, Elizabeth Batts, lived to 84 years old. She had 6 children, all of whom predeceased her. And so she became the, let's say, the heir of that heritage, except that she burned all of their private correspondence. So we almost have no word of her or Cook himself in private, only as official logs. And meanwhile, Joseph Banks went back to become the head of the Royal Society, and he was a very pompous and arrogant fellow, and he was lampooned in the press here. He was called the South Sea Butterfly. He came out of the mud of the tropics, and now he spreads it all around. So this is satire of the era. Meanwhile, Cook himself was given a modest burial back, finally his hand only, and then this memorial in a church in Surrey for his whole family. But all over the Pacific, you can see monuments to him. This one's in Gisborne, New Zealand, where it's the only statue of Cook where he gets to wear sunglasses. You know, it's pretty bright out there. And meanwhile, his cottage from outside of Whitby, Yorkshire, was brought to a park in Melbourne, where it stands to this day, reconstructed stone by stone. And then his ship, the Endeavour, has been reproduced and such. The original ship was taken as a hulk to America, and it was sunk in Newport, Rhode Island, where it remains today. It's not been excavated. But his name goes on, particularly in Cook cruises, and there are many imitators and impersonators. And so some people, well, the age of exploration is certainly finished. Nobody could do such a thing ever again. Well, some people try. This is an old friend of mine, Reed Stowe, who built himself this big schooner, and he wanted me to go with him on the world's longest voyage around the world, 3 years without resupplying or touching land. Well, I had other things to do, and so he didn't want to go alone, so he convinced this woman, Sonia, who was 20-something and never been sailing before, and he talked her into it, and so they sailed out of New York on their 3-year voyage. By the time they got to off Western Australia, she was so ill and in bed that he was very worried about her health. So he had her medevaced into Perth. And then they found out that she contracted the only medical ailment that only women get at sea. Anybody know what that is? Oh, such adult audience. I like that. Anyway, yes, she ended up having a baby, but he sailed on. And so in the following commentary said, what kind of a man would take a woman to sea, get her pregnant, put her ashore, and sail away? A sailor, obviously. And he did continue. He went more than 3 years by himself, lolling around in the South Pacific, going around Antarctica. He came back But now he's living on his boat with her and the kid in Carolina. But he said, were he French, he would be a national hero. As a mere American, everybody thinks he's crazy and still crazy. And I told him he should come out and tell a story on a ship like this. He said, I'm not that social, because he came back to his dock and he could not speak. It took him a week before he could utter any words even. Well, anyway, Cook's name goes on in the Straits, and the Endeavour name has gone on in spaceships, and so this is a great heritage of nautical history and human achievement, and particularly it opened up this whole part of the world where we now get to visit and enjoy its particular qualities. And hopefully we'll see more sunshine, and I believe that's the one you want to follow, because it usually goes down over there. Anyway, have a great voyage in the wake of Captain Cook. Thank you very much. Okay.